The divorce papers weren't just a notification of the end. They were a meticulously crafted weapon designed to leave me homeless and bankrupt within 48 hours of our anniversary. As I stood in the marble-floored lobby of the high-rise law firm, the receptionist's pitying expression confirmed exactly what I had feared. The house, the savings, and even my late father's antique collection had already been transferred into a shell corporation owned entirely by my mother-in-law. Everything I had spent 7 years building with Mark had been systematically dismantled while I was busy planning a celebration for a life I thought was secure. My husband, the man who held my hand every morning as we drank coffee, had turned our marriage into a strategic extraction project. Life before the discovery was a picture of domestic perfection, or at least that's what the golden-hued sunlight in our kitchen suggested every morning. I loved the way the granite island felt cool under my palms, while the smell of freshly ground Colombian coffee beans filled the air. Mark always insisted on preparing breakfast, a small, intimate ritual that made me feel cherished. He was a successful consultant, always busy, always focused, and I was the dutiful wife who managed our investments and renovated the beautiful craftsman house that had been in my family for 3 generations. Our house wasn't just a property, it was a sanctuary of polished oak floors, high ceilings, and memories of my childhood. When I married Mark, he had been the one to encourage me to keep the house in my name, a gesture I interpreted as chivalry at the time. "It's your legacy, Elena," he would say, stroking my hair as we sat on the porch. "I want to be the one who maintains it for you, to prove I'm committed to our future." Looking back, the way he emphasized the maintenance should have been a red flag. He never spoke about ownership, he spoke about stewardship. Then there was Beatrice, my mother-in-law. She was a woman who moved through the world like a shark in a velvet cloak. At first, her intrusion was subtle. A comment about how the property taxes were draining our liquidity, or a helpful suggestion that we consolidate our assets into a family trust to protect us from market volatility. I had brushed off her overbearing presence as mere maternal anxiety, though I always felt a strange, cold shiver whenever she inspected my jewelry box or asked pointed questions about the title deeds to the house. Mark's behavior began to shift in small, almost imperceptible increments. He started coming home later, smelling of sharp, synthetic perfume that certainly didn't belong to me, and he began to guard his laptop with a ferocity that seemed out of place in a healthy marriage. Whenever I mentioned the strange discrepancies in our monthly budget, the missing thousands, the unexplained fees, he would deflect with ease. "It's just leverage, babe. We're diversifying. You don't understand the complexity of these high-stakes investments, and honestly, you don't need to worry your pretty head about it." I trusted him. I trusted him with my history, my finances, and my heart. I remember standing in the living room one rainy Tuesday, watching him fiddle with a set of documents on the mahogany desk. He looked up, caught me watching, and for a split second, his face went deathly pale before he masked it with a practiced, charming smile. That was the last moment I felt truly at peace, though I didn't realize it then. I was standing on a foundation that had been hollowed out, waiting for the structural collapse, while he sat across from me, sipping his tea and planning the exact day he would leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back. I had been so distracted by the preparations for our 7th anniversary, the catering, and the guest list, that I failed to notice the silence growing between us. The house, usually so warm and filled with the laughter of friends, began to feel like a stage set, beautifully arranged, but cold and lacking any real substance. I was an actress in a play written by people who were waiting for the final curtain call to walk away with the keys to my kingdom. I just didn't know yet that the tragedy wasn't just about money. It was about the cold, calculating betrayal of every vow we had ever whispered in the dark. The first tremor arrived in the form of a certified letter I found tucked behind the decorative mail tray in the foyer. It was addressed to the proprietor of our home, not to me or Mark. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. A notice of a pending lien on the property, citing a massive loan taken out against the equity. I felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline pierce through my chest. I confronted Mark that evening, clutching the paper until my knuckles turned white. He didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed, his eyes skimming over the document with a dismissive sigh. He claimed it was a clerical error, a mix-up with a client's filing, and promised to handle it with his accountant the next morning. I wanted to believe him, but for the first time, his voice lacked that familiar, soothing cadence. It sounded hollow, like a script he was reciting under duress. The second warning was more visceral. Beatrice paid an unannounced visit, entering our home with her own set of keys she had accidentally kept after helping us with the initial renovations. She spent an hour pacing through my living room, her eyes darting toward the antique mahogany secretary desk where I kept my grandfather's journals. She didn't offer tea or pleasantries. Instead, she asked if I had considered how difficult it would be to maintain such an old, crumbling house in a failing economy. Her tone was patronizing, almost predatory. "Some people are simply not built for the weight of legacy, Elena," she murmured, brushing a speck of dust off the mantelpiece as if she were already measuring the space for her own things. "Sometimes, the kindest thing one can do is let go before the floor falls out from under you." I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was being paranoid, but the air in our home had become suffocatingly thin. Mark became a ghost in his own life. He stopped sleeping in our bed, claiming he had to work late in his study, and I often woke up to the faint, persistent tapping of his keyboard at 3 a.m. When I brought him coffee in his study, he would slam his laptop shut so quickly that his wrist struck the wood with a hollow thud. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements jerky and agitated. He wasn't working on investments, he was performing an excavation. The point of no return arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of gray, miserable afternoon that feels heavy with omens. Mark had forgotten his phone on the kitchen counter when he rushed out for a meeting he claimed was with an investor. I didn't intend to look, but a notification lit up the screen. A message from a local law firm titled, "Asset Transfer Confirmation." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My heart began to drum a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs, and the hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded like a roar in my ears. With shaking fingers, I unlocked the device. I clicked into the email thread. It wasn't just an asset transfer, it was a total liquidation plan. There were PDFs of documents, deeds, bank account closures, and an incredibly detailed separation strategy drafted by Beatrice's own attorney. The documents showed that Mark had forged my digital signature on dozens of financial authorizations over the past 6 months. I sank to the floor, my back against the cold tile of the island. The kitchen, once my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a tomb. My breathing became shallow, the air tasting of metallic fear. I scrolled further, reaching a document that finally broke the last thread of my composure. A notarized quitclaim deed, dated for the day after our anniversary, effectively signing the house over to a shell corporation controlled by Beatrice. I felt the blood drain from my extremities, leaving my hands numb and useless. The betrayal wasn't just a financial hit, it was a total erasure. I was being legally wiped from my own existence. I sat there in the silence, the screen's harsh blue light illuminating the devastating reality of my marriage. Every memory, every shared joke, every promise we had made was just a calculated distraction to keep me blind while they picked my pockets clean. The ground beneath me didn't just feel unstable, it had vanished entirely. I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore, I was fighting for the truth of my own life. And as the realization settled into my bones, a strange, terrifying clarity began to replace the panic. I looked at the phone in my lap, the proof of my own downfall, and realized that while they thought I was a victim, they had made one fatal mistake. They had left me with the evidence, and I was finally starting to see the architecture of their trap. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the rhythmic, aggressive ticking of the wall clock, a sound that now felt like a countdown to my own destruction. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The panic had burned out, leaving behind a cold, crystalline anger that sharpened my senses to a razor's edge. I stood up, my legs feeling strangely steady, and walked to the study. I needed to see him, to watch the mask slip, even if it meant destroying the last shred of sanity I had left. Mark was sitting at his desk, his posture hunched, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of his monitors. He didn't hear me enter. He was busy typing something, another email, another lie, into a legal portal. I reached out and pulled the power cord from the wall. The sudden darkness was jarring, and his shout of frustration was sharp and guttural. "What the hell, Elena? Are you insane?" he snapped, his voice tight with irritation as he fumbled for a flashlight on his desk. "The quitclaim deed, Mark," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through the shadows. "The transfer to your mother's company. I know everything." He went still. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, shakily illuminating my face. For a moment, he didn't speak, his breath catching in his throat. When he finally looked up, the charm had vanished, replaced by a cold, transactional hardness I had never seen before. "You shouldn't have been looking through my phone. That's a massive breach of trust." "Trust?" I laughed, a brittle, jagged sound. "You spent 6 months forging my signature, stealing my family's history, and conspiring with your mother to throw me onto the street, and you're lecturing me about trust?" He stood up, towering over me, trying to regain his dominant stance. "You're being dramatic. It's a restructuring, Elena. We were drowning in taxes and maintenance. Mother offered a way out. She's protecting us." "She's protecting you," I countered, stepping into his space. "I checked the corporate filing. My name isn't on the board. My name isn't anywhere. I'm being liquidated, Mark. Just like the antiques, just like the savings. You sold me out for a debt-free exit strategy." He scoffed, turning away to pace the room. "You were never good at finances. You wanted the house, you wanted the aesthetic, but you couldn't afford the reality. I did what a husband is supposed to do. I took control when you failed to." The sheer audacity of his gaslighting hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. "You forged my signature, Mark. That's not taking control. That's a felony." As if summoned by the tension, the front door clicked open. Beatrice walked in, her footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, confident pace. She didn't look surprised to see us in the dark. She looked satisfied. She leaned against the doorframe, her eyes tracing the room as if she were already counting the value of the furniture. "I see the truth has finally surfaced," Beatrice said, her voice smooth and chillingly composed. "I told you, Mark, she would eventually go snooping. You were too careless with that phone." "Mother, stay out of this," Mark muttered, his confidence wavering under her gaze. Beatrice strode into the room, ignoring him completely, her focus entirely on me. "Let's be adults, Elena. You have no money, no legal recourse, and no evidence that this wasn't a consensual transfer. You signed the initial digital authorizations months ago during our investment planning sessions. You're a co-conspirator in your own ruin, legally speaking. If you fight this, the litigation will drain whatever pennies you have left, and you'll end up with a criminal record for fraud while we keep the house." She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. She tossed it onto the desk, the sound landing with a heavy, final thud. "Sign these papers. Walk away quietly, and we won't involve the authorities in your little spending irregularities. Keep the car, take your personal belongings, and vanish. It's a generous exit, all things considered." Mark looked at me, his eyes pleading, not for forgiveness, but for compliance. "Just do it, Elle. It's over. There's no point in making this ugly." I looked at the documents, then at the two people who had built a life out of my vulnerabilities. I felt the cold, hard weight of the phone in my pocket, a device that had captured every incriminating email and every timestamp of his digital fraud. I wasn't just holding proof, I was holding their future. I turned to Beatrice, a smile forming on my lips, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You're right, Beatrice," I said, my voice low and steady. "The fight is over, but you seem to have forgotten one thing. I'm the one who restored this house. I'm the one who knew where all the skeletons were buried. You thought you were the architect of this trap, but you didn't check the blueprints of who you were dealing with." Beatrice let out a short, dismissive laugh that echoed against the bookshelves. "Blueprints, Elena? Don't be poetic. You are an exhausted woman with no leverage. Sign the papers, or we start the eviction process tomorrow morning. Mark, tell her." Mark shifted his weight, his eyes darting between us. He looked small, stripped of the arrogance he usually wore like armor. "Elena, just do it. I have the papers for the car title right there. We can be done with this tonight." "Done with this?" I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "You think this ends with a signature? You forgot that while you were managing the assets, I was the one handling the tax filings. You and your mother were so focused on stealing the equity that you didn't notice I had been documenting every single restructuring meeting you had with that shady shell corporation since January." The room grew deathly quiet. I saw the first hairline fracture in Beatrice's composure, a slight narrowing of her eyes. "What are you talking about?" Mark snapped, his voice rising in pitch. "You didn't have access to those files." "I didn't need access," I replied, pulling the phone from my pocket and tapping the screen. "I have a remote backup of the cloud drive you were using to coordinate the forgeries. Every email from your attorney, every investment thread where you discussed the liquidation of my inheritance, and most importantly, the recording of the conversation you had with Beatrice last week about how to get rid of the wife once the house was secured." Mark's face drained of color, his jaw dropping open. Beatrice, however, stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "Give me that phone, Elena. You're bluffing. You wouldn't risk your reputation by going to the police." "My reputation?" I took a step toward her, the space between us charged with electricity. "You've already spent 6 months destroying it by making it look like I was squandering our funds. I have nothing left to lose, Beatrice. That makes me the most dangerous person you've ever met." I turned the phone around, showing them the time-stamped files. "I've already forwarded a copy of this entire drive to my father's old business partner, a man who happens to be a retired forensic accountant. He's already seen the forgeries, and he's not the only one. I also sent a copy to the bank's internal fraud department. They take a dim view of mortgage fraud involving shell companies." Mark lunged for the phone, but I was faster, sidestepping him with a grace that surprised us both. I retreated toward the door, my thumb hovering over the screen. "Don't touch me, Mark. If you lay a hand on me, this goes to the police immediately. And trust me, the fraud unit is already on their way to the bank to freeze the accounts. You haven't just stolen my house, you've triggered a federal audit." Beatrice's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You stupid, petty girl! Do you have any idea who we know? We can bury you!" "You tried," I said, my voice cold as ice. "And you failed because you underestimated the person you lived with. You thought I was a puppet, but puppets eventually learn to cut their own strings." Mark was hyperventilating now, his hands pressed against his temples. "Elena, please! If the bank freezes the accounts, we're finished. We have creditors coming for us from the other investments. We can fix this. Let's just delete those files, and I'll walk away from the house. I'll let you have it back." "Oh, Mark," I said, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping me. "You don't get it. There is no us to fix. There is no negotiation. You didn't just break a marriage. You tried to delete my life. The only thing left to discuss is whether you want to be arrested here or at the precinct." I backed into the hallway, my finger hitting the send button on an email to the district attorney's office. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the sound of their sudden, panicked realization. Beatrice was frantically typing on her phone, likely trying to call her lawyer, while Mark slumped against the desk, his head in his hands. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady, my heart finally slowing its frantic pace. "And when the police arrive, I suggest you have the keys to this house on the counter, because for the next few hours, I'm going to be with my lawyer, and by morning, the ownership of this home will be the least of your concerns." I walked toward the front door, feeling a strange, weightless sensation in my chest. For the first time in 7 years, I wasn't looking back to see if Mark was following me or if Beatrice was judging me. I was simply walking, and with every step toward the door, the chains they had forged around me began to shatter. I walked out into the cool night air, the streetlights illuminating the path to a life I had almost lost and had just reclaimed. The transformation did not happen all at once. It was a slow, methodical hardening of my resolve that began the moment I stepped off the porch and into the cool, biting air of the night. As I sat in my car, waiting for the police to arrive at the house, I felt a strange, quiet detachment. The rage that had fueled my confrontation had crystallized into a cold, clinical focus. I was no longer the woman who fretted over dinner parties or sought validation from a man who viewed me as a line item on a balance sheet. I was a survivor, and I had the scalpel in my hand. The following weeks were a blur of depositions and legal maneuvers. The forensic audit proved to be the final nail in the coffin for Mark and Beatrice. Because I had preemptively provided the evidence to the bank's fraud department, the shell corporation was frozen before they could funnel the remaining capital into offshore accounts. When the police finally executed the warrant at the house, they didn't just find documents, they found a paper trail of half-baked real estate scams that Beatrice had been running for years. Mark, desperate to save himself, turned on his mother within 48 hours, providing testimony about her orchestration of the scheme. It was a pathetic display of cowardice that only ensured they would both face charges. The courtroom felt surprisingly small for the magnitude of the betrayal. I watched from the gallery as the judge handed down the sentences. Mark looked pale and unrecognizable, his suit hanging off his frame like he'd aged a decade in a single month. Beatrice, stripped of her velvet-cloaked arrogance, stared straight ahead, a woman who had finally run out of pawns. The house was returned to me after a lengthy legal battle, the title finally cleared of the predatory liens. But as I walked through the quiet, empty rooms for the first time after the trial, I realized I didn't want to live there anymore. The ghost of who I used to be lingered in every corner, and I was finally ready to let her go. 6 months later, I sat on the veranda of a small, sun-drenched cottage 300 miles away from the city. The air here smelled of pine needles and damp earth, not the sterile, expensive scent of the life I had left behind. I had sold the old craftsman house, using the proceeds to start a foundation for women who had been financially coerced in their marriages. It felt like a cleansing fire, turning the ashes of my old life into something that could actually sustain others. I held a cup of tea in my hands, the ceramic warm against my palms, and watched the sunrise paint the horizon in shades of soft amber and violet. My phone chimed with a message from my lawyer. The final paperwork for the absolute discharge of my debts was signed. It was finally over. I had lost the version of myself that believed in fairy tales, but I had gained a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. I leaned back in the wicker chair, listening to the birds begin their morning chorus. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibilities. I had learned the hard way that loyalty is not a debt to be repaid, but a gift to be earned. As I looked out at the rolling hills, I realized that my freedom hadn't been stolen, it had been waiting for me to reclaim it. I took a slow, steady sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, and whispered to the quiet morning. The best revenge isn't the ruin of others, it's the refusal to let them ruin you.